Today I'm going to speak about issues of, the title of the talk is called Global Antisemitism, A Crisis of Modernity. And I'm going to put around the book. We actually just published a book. It's a 5-volume book. This is 1 volume. On a conference that we organized. It was the largest conference ever, largest academic conference ever on anti-Semitism. So we organized it at Yale in 2010. We had 107 speakers over a 3-day period. And we've produced 5 volumes, 5 books of about 70 articles. And this is one volume. And it's a rough draft. The version will be available on our website in the next 3 or 4 weeks, so you can download it for free or buy a hard copy. So this book starts with reviewing the conference on anti-Semitism, and to make a long story short, we had 107 speakers from 23 countries. We had leading up-and-coming scholars, postdoc students from all over the world, leading scholars who've dedicated their entire life, academic life and career, to dealing with anti-Semitism. And this conference was it was the beginning of the end at Yale. And the reason why it was the beginning of the end is that we're in a moment in this, what I call the crisis of modernity, in which to deal with this reactionary social movement which is sweeping the Middle East, sweeping Islamic societies, is politically incorrect to deal with in the West. And it's politically incorrect for all sorts of reasons. There's, for good reason in the intellectual environment, there was this sort of post-colonial movement that the West, especially after World War II, began to realize that their colonial exploits had a very negative side, and there was a negative side to modernity. Elias talks about the civilizing process and how when we go to civilize the other, a tendency and perhaps the logical outcome of civilizing the other could result and has resulted in forms of genocide. So after World War II, after the excesses of nationalism, once Western scholars began to look at the history of slavery, of colonialism, and of genocide, places in the New World like Canada, the United States, the Americas, Australia, South Africa, places that were established on racist, colonial theology, philosophy, and tactics, Western intellectuals after World War II and after the Holocaust began to critically look at their history. So to criticize those who were once colonized, to criticize those who were once the object of our racist, colonial bigotry, is problematic, and it ought to be problematic, by the way. But what has happened in this post-colonial moment is our inability to criticize the other even when they deserve to be criticized. And a reactionary social movement like radical political Islam, I'm not speaking about Muslims and I'm not speaking about Islam, but radical political Islam, is a reactionary social movement that is diametrically opposed to what everybody in this room believes in. If you believe that in citizenship, the rights of women, the rights of gay people, the rights of minorities ought to be enshrined, that everybody ought to be equal under one legal system and have strong notions of citizenship. If you're opposed to racist notions like Jews are the descendants of apes and pigs or should be exterminated, then there's a problem. And the Academy, what happened at Yale, there is a limitation for political reasons, for funding reasons, for oil-related reasons, for geostrategic reasons, not to allow this problem to become an issue. It gets in the way. And I dare say what's happened in the last several days with the Obama administration and other administrations trying to expedite a treaty with the Iranian revolutionary regime, a regime which clearly, not once in a while, but its raison d'etre is to rid the Jews of this region, of the Middle East. It's not 1967 boundaries or 1973 boundaries or 1948 boundaries. It's to eradicate the Jewish people, the descendants of apes and pigs. Subhuman, non-humans have to be eradicated from the garment of Islam. And Western leaders are willing to set aside inconveniences in trade, inconveniences in the price of oil, inconvenience in banking and other ways to make profits at the expense of not just Jews, not only Jews, but Baha'is, other religious minorities, women, gay people, moderate people, people who care about democracy. That is almost irrelevant in the eyes of too many Western governments and Western intellectuals. So what we ran into as a research center is very much, I would argue, symbolic of the times that we live in. How to critique a reactionary social movement when our own intellectual world, the world of postmodernity, Edward Said, Michel Foucault, which speaks about postmodernism and relativism. How do we in the West stand up for human rights, stand up for notions of what is right and what is wrong, what is just and what is unjust, when our own philosophical framework is become replaced by a relativist model? And this is, in a sense, the title of the paper is Global Anti-Semitism, a Crisis of Modernity. I think tries to capture the crisis of not only of capitalism and of capital, but the crisis of modernity. And the crisis is, are we capable of standing up and defending modernity? So the bad side of modernity was the colonial project, was racism, genocide, even the Holocaust. This is the dark side of modernity. But the positive side, the enlightened side, the side of light, democratic principles, citizenship, there's a positive element to modernity. And are we able, in a sense, to understand and protect these very important notions in which we are dependent upon and we don't inherit? So the conference and the work of our institute really comes at this moment, and I think we had 600 people at the event. It was a major event, and this was the beginning of the end. The Muslim Brotherhood, Iranian interests, Saudi interests sort of descended upon Yale, and to make a long story short, we were eventually closed down. ISGAP is now, the Torah says one door closes, other doors open. So we're running programs at McGill, Fordham, Stanford, Harvard University. We started at Columbia University. We're opening in Miami. And in the end of November, we're opening at Sapienza University. We're creating an institute in Rome. So sometimes when one door closes, others open. So there is a growing interest in this issue and trying to understand the contemporary context of global anti-Semitism. So it's not uncommon for scholars of anti-Semitism, especially those who are engaged in the study of its contemporary manifestations, to be labeled as right-wing, neoconservative, or Islamophobic. Likewise, despite their obvious and sometimes extraordinary credentials, their scholarship is also unfairly criticized or condemned as being advocacy. Such accusations are often made by those who engage in advocacy themselves and actually constitute a form of anti-Semitism. Others simply embrace the gatekeeper role in the academy, which Robin Cohn describes as an attempt to maintain the status quo on behalf of institutional interests. There's also a theory by Bonich that it's a theory of the middleman minorities, which is a famous theory in sociology in which the minority has to become the gatekeeper, or plays the gatekeeper within the institution. And we can see tragically that there are many Jewish intellectuals, I hate to say it, but it's actually the truth, Jewish intellectuals who have become the gatekeepers, who stand up to criticize Israel with more vehemence than many others, and to also quiet down those of us who want to study anti-Semitism as scholarship, and we're condemned as being right-wing, Islamophobic, and the like. So it's very interesting. So these two theories by Cohn and Bonich are very important to understand the role of minorities coming into the institutions, coming into the academy. And I think in a fantastic example of this, which is reminiscent of the McCarthy era, we have an example of Nathan Glazer, who was a very important sociologist, social thinker of the time, who worked on behalf of the McCarthy, Joe McCarthy, and he took it upon himself to spy on and report to the committee on the Jewish community of scholars and political activists in order to silence political views that were deemed unacceptable at the time. So a very prominent scholar took it upon himself, told McCarthy, I'll take care of the Jewish community, you don't spy on the Jewish community, I'll do it for you, and he reported to the committee. So it's interesting that people like Chomsky, Finkelstein, and many others, the New York Times, I can think of I forget his name, I'm having a moment here, the professor of NYU is now working for Haaretz. Officially, no, he's Obama's buddy, young guy, South African born. Peter Beinart. People like this who, there's an irrationality that people who claim to be liberal and progressive are actually defending Islamists. So the academic activities, in particular those that examine state-sponsored anti-Semitism, Iran, the Muslim Brotherhood, and other sensitive issues, are denounced as advocacy by those with an interest in promoting U.S. administration's general policy of engagement with Islamic states, which I wrote this 3 years ago, this part of the introduction, and imagine 3 years ago, can you imagine if we were, over 100,000 dead Syrians, 3 million refugees, Libya in flames, Egypt is a disaster, and Western governments in bed with Islamists, courting Islamists, and still to this day. And in a sense, in this environment, I call in this article that there has to be serious research and analysis of who's funding institutions, who's funding universities, who's funding the media, and why is there silence on this issue? The fact that Al Jazeera, which is now reaching more than 50 million Americans, was sold to this group for tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars by Gore. How do we accept this outlet of hatred, of inspiring genocidal anti-Semitism, homophobia, and sexism, and there's not much of an opposition to this? Who's benefiting from this, etc. So the article that I'm going to speak to now deals with global anti-Semitism and the crisis of modernity, which currently affects core elements of Western society and civilization. Is it possible that the emergence of the current wave of global anti-Semitism both reflects and forms a part of a wider attack on the core elements of modernity, notions of enlightenment and Western civilization more generally, by reactionary social forces empowered by the crisis of capitalism? The crisis of capitalism. It is against this background that participants in our conference came from far and wide to engage. So the crisis of capitalism, I'll just say as a footnote, is that in the last several decades we entered into this period of neoliberal globalization that has been governed by neoliberal economic and political policies. So on the one hand, globalization has brought people together as never before, goods, services, communication, business, travel, investments, and the like, but at the same time has segregated people as never before. And we're in a moment where those of us who initiate globalized relations have power, and those of us who are on the receiving end, who become stuck in time, stuck in space, who cannot move, are on the receiving end of globalization. Those are the weak and marginalized. And we're created a situation where, I won't go into too much detail, but we see as the result of neoliberal globalization, on the one hand, the amass of tremendous wealth in the hands of segments of society as never before. Consumption of certain things are at levels that a few decades ago would seem absurd. And at the same time, we have billions of people living on a couple of dollars a day. Societies, institutions, and now states are literally disintegrating. So when these states disintegrate, when these institutions that we rely on for integration, for healthcare, education, for hope, are weakening or disintegrating, there's a vacuum. And the vacuum that is being filled in many of the Islamic states, for example, is this radical reactionary movement that fills the gap through the mosque, providing good services, healthcare, education, and the like, when the state, the modern state, which promised democracy, which promised progress, which promised a better future, is basically deemed impotent, and there's no future. People are frustrated, it's corrupt and crumbling, and the alternative is this reactionary social movement. And at one level, I would argue this, to me, is reminiscent of the interwar period after World War I, where huge swaths of the population were living in societies that the state was disintegrating, the economy disintegrated, governance disintegrated, and this reactionary social movement with easy answers mobilized people for all sorts of reasons. I won't go into the complex, obviously, history. You can do a course on just this, but I'm going to sum it up in 3 sentences. But it's in these conditions that we learnt that reactionary social movements emerge. After World War II, with international law, the United Nations, safeguards on the economy, we've seemed to forget this moment and these lessons. And now I would argue that we've repeated it on a global scale, where there are many marginalized, hungry, angry, disenfranchised people who are afraid, and there's a social movement, a radical social movement, with easy to understand answers and senses of real empowerment on the rise. The sick thing is, if I may say, is that radical Islamists perceive the state as a vestige of Western colonialism and imperialism, and at the same time neoliberals, the leaders of our economic systems, also perceive the state as problematic. That if we could only limit the power of the state, diffuse the state, that the democracy will flow, the economies will grow, that everybody will be uplifted. But we know from World War I, World War II, that that's a fallacy. That in the capitalist system, there are those who do not have and we need to safeguard them to ensure basic levels of housing, education, healthcare, hope for a future, because we know from World War II and the Holocaust that when people don't have hope and they're marginalized to such an extent, when violence descends on them, that the possibility of horrific destruction emerges. And I would say that we are in a moment on a global scale very similar to that moment on many levels. So anti-Semitism is a complex and at times perplexing form of hatred. Some observers refer to it as the longest hatred. It spans centuries of history, infecting different societies, religious and philosophical and political movements, and even civilizations. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, some have argued that anti-Semitism illustrates the limitations of Enlightenment and modernity itself. Manifestations of anti-Semitism occur in numerous ideological-based narratives and in constructed notions of identities such as belonging and otherness, race and ethnicity, as well as nationalisms and anti-nationalist movements. In the contemporary context of globalized relations, it appears that anti-Semitism has taken on a new complex and changing form that needs to be decoded, mapped, and exposed. The academic study of anti-Semitism, like prejudice more generally, has a long and impressive intellectual history and history of research. It remains a topic of ongoing political importance and scholarly engagement. However, especially at this important historical juncture, unlike prejudice and discrimination directed at other social groups, anti-Semitism, in particular its contemporary forms and processes associated with it, is almost always studied outside organized academic frameworks. The processes of globalization has led to an increase of adversarial identity politics. In this environment, Israel, as a central manifestation of contemporary Jewish identity, and Jews more generally, have become the focus of scapegoating and hateful rhetoric. At a more structural and socio-historical level, old ideologies and tendencies of anti-Semitism have re-emerged and are being fused with anti-Zionism or Israel bashing in what many cases might be more appropriately described as Israel bashing. The old theological and racist forms of European anti-Semitism are being combined with anti-Jewish and anti-Israel pronouncements emanating from the Muslim world, which is located mainly but not exclusively in and around the Middle East. Contemporary globalization and the related socioeconomic, cultural, and political processes are being fused with these historical tendencies, creating the conditions that pose a threat to Jewish people and Jewish communities in the diaspora. And we saw the report that came out last week from the European Union. A third of the Jews in Europe are considering to leave. More than 60% feel threatened, and the like. So anti-Semitism is serious. In addition, new structural realities within the realm of international relations and the emergence of anti-Israel propensities appear to pose a threat to Israel and the Jewish people in a manner not seen since the end of World War II. Once again, in this age of globalization, the Jewish people seem to be caught between the aristocracy or the wealthy establishment, the core, and the marginalized or disenfranchised masses, the periphery, as we have seen throughout much of history. With the advent of the socialism of fools, a term describing the replacement of the search for real social and political equity with anti-Semitism that is frequently attributed to August Babel, Jews continued to be targeted. In much the same way, the current marginalization of Jewish people in the Arab world, or more accurately, the marginalization of the image of the Jew, since most of the Jews were pressured to leave Arab countries in the 1940s through to the 1970s, after a strong presence for thousands of years, is staggering. As a social movement in the Middle East has turned to their own version of the socialism of fools, i.e. the anti-Semitism of radical political Islam, they have incorporated lethal forms of European genocidal anti-Semitism as the fuel for their social movement. However, many scholars, policymakers, and journalists of record still refuse to acknowledge this fact and to critically examine the ideology and mission of the social movement. So the mere examination of the social movement is a taboo subject, literally, which is extraordinary because a university is supposed to be a place where you can discuss, debate, and argue. So anti-Judaism is one of the most complex and at times perplexing forms of hatred. As evident from the range of, the term anti-Semitism, which was coined in the 1870s by Wilhelm Marr, is also controversial and at times confusing. Yet despite its epistemological limitations and contradictions, it remains a valid and useful term. The term refers specifically to prejudice and discrimination against the Jewish people. Some, incorrectly or for reasons of political expediency, use the term to refer to prejudice of all so-called Semitic peoples, claiming that Arab people cannot be anti-Semites as they are Semitic themselves. This is fine in terms of etymological musing, but in terms of history of language and thought, where the terms acquire specific meaning over time that diverge from their etymological origins. In fact, anti-Semitism clearly refers to a specific form of hatred that is mainly European in origin and focuses upon Jewish people. Some scholars prefer to use the term anti-Semitism without the hyphen or not capitalized, since it refers to a form of hatred or a phenomenon rather than a specific biological determined group. Emil Fackenheim, for example, used the unhyphenated term for this reason, which we do as well in our work. Some scholars have examined the complexities of anti-Semitism, claim that it takes several forms, including social, economic, political, and cultural, as well as religious. René Koenig, for example, contends that these different forms of anti-Semitism demonstrate that the origins of anti-Semitism can be rooted in different historical periods and places. When religion, in particular Christianity, represented the dominant way to perceive reality, the Jews were regarded as followers of the wrong religion. It was also believed that the refusal to accept the Christian Messiah disqualified them from any form of redemption, and even that Jewish stubbornness hindered world redemption. Finally, it is hardly necessary to recall that Jews were accused of deicide. When the dominant manner in which Europeans perceived reality was based on nation-states or biological notions of race and ethnicity, the Jews were constructed as belonging to another inferior race or a dangerous race. According to the Nazis and others who subscribed to this racist belief, for example, they perceived Jews as polluting the Aryan race, and they needed to be removed completely in order to save the purity of the race and the nation. So there's something inherently genocidal in anti-Semitism, in that redemption of the world through religion. A redemption of the race or the nation is contingent not just on the Jewish on the Jew, right, but on the elimination or conversion of the Jew. So if the Jew doesn't convert, or the Jew is not taken out of the race or the nation fails, or the Christians can't receive redemption, or the world can't be redeemed. So there's something different, I would argue, in anti-Semitism, very dangerously different in anti-Semitism, in that it's inherently genocidal, because the Jews need to be changed or removed. And that's, I think, different than other forms of hatreds. At the present, some argue for religious reasons that that self-determinations of the Jew, of the non-Muslim other, on so-called Islamic land is a sin and should not be tolerated. Others in the West see Jewish stubbornness as the cause of radical Islam and jihadism, which, amazingly, is a form of not only anti-Semitism but stupidity. And we see many of the realists with the Obama administration in the last 5 years literally believing that if it wasn't for the stubbornness of the Jews, of the Israelis, of the territories, of the boundaries, that jihadism and radical Islam would dissipate. So no responsibility for neoliberal policies, no responsibility for the catastrophe of the economy, no responsibility for the fact that the vast majority of Egyptians are illiterate and live on $1 a day. No responsibility. If only the Jews would change, all of this would go away and nirvana will emerge. This is anti-Semitism, plain and simple. When it comes to Israeli policies and existence, they believe that if only the Jews were to change, the problems of the region and the international relations as a whole would be resolved. If taken to its logical conclusion, this perspective can lead to great destruction, like other historical manifestations of anti-Semitism, since its aims, the objective, is the eradication of Israel or any semblance of Jewish self-determination in the region. Despite the complete rejection of the Jewish narrative by the Iranian regime, Hamas, Hezbollah, and other Salafists and Islamists, many observers focus on the other and are content to blame the victim of this ideology without examining the context. In fact, attempts to critically examine these reactionary views are often deemed politically unacceptable, and they're stopped. If you go to speak to scholars in the academy, in Europe and North America, who have the courage to examine this anti-Semitism, ask them about their careers. Ask them how popular they are in their departments, how easy it is for them to get tenure or promoted. It's amazing. This contemporary form of anti-Semitism has many layers. New forms are mixed with old ones, such as conspiracy theories about Jewish power and culture, apocalyptic theories concerning the Jews. For example, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which played a key role in creating the conditions for the Holocaust, as well as European anti-Semitism more generally, has now become part of the political and cultural mainstream in several Arab and Muslim societies. The above-mentioned complexities make it difficult to define the different forms that anti-Semitism takes. This in turn makes it problematic to address and analyze the subject in itself. It is no wonder then that the contemporary forms of anti-Semitism have always been difficult, if not impossible, to acknowledge, study, and measure and oppose in its moment. So this is the moment for the anti-Semitism which I just described. We can now look at theological anti-Semitism of the church, of the Christians, and the church, the Pope, today, we all condemn the centuries of Christian anti-Semitism. Everybody does. Every kind of civilized person, from the Pope to scholars, we all condemn it. When we look at the racist anti-Semitism of the Nazis, of fascism, every progressive, liberal, decent intellectual, unless they're a neo-fascist racist, everybody condemns the old anti-Semitism of the past. We all like to put monuments and lay wreaths, and it's all fine to fight the fascism of 70 years ago. But in its moment, in its day, the Jews and scholars and people who tried to debunk the racist mythologies, they were out of the canon. They were out of the academy. And you can look at the moment in history. I was just giving a lecture at Raphael's course in urban studies. People like W.E.B. Du Bois, famous urban studies scholar, could not get a job in the United States because he fought the canon of racist ideology that came out of the Chicago school. It wasn't acceptable. So people like the Mass Psychology of Fascism. Who wrote the Mass Psychology of Fascism? Wilhelm Reich. Couldn't get a job, kicked out of the Communist Party. People who debunked the mythologies of the moment were not accepted. And those of us fighting the dehumanization and demonization of Israel, we feel it too. Amazing. Just as a footnote, the New York Times, the liberal, Jewish influence, Upper West Side, New York, American paper of record, can write an op-ed piece in 2013 defining the current Iranian revolutionary regime as moderates and Netanyahu in the next breath as the problem. And this is 2013 when scholars, and we know what the Iranian revolutionary regime perceives of Baha'is and of women, of gay people, and certainly of Jews. But there's this profound inability to address this issue. It's a taboo subject because if you're progressive, you can't critique those who were once colonized. The context of the contemporary global anti-Semitism looks at international relations, which are increasingly in a state of flux and turmoil, as well as notions of tolerance, democratic principles, ideals, human rights, and robust citizenship. These values appear to be receding within many institutions in society, while the international community seems to be less strident in trying to defend them. It would appear that the Jew, or perhaps more importantly the image of the Jew, or the imaginary Jew, described by Alain Finkielkraut, is at the middle of this global moment. Both historically and today, anti-Semitism is a social disease that begins with Jews, but it never ends with Jews, making the Jewish people perhaps the proverbial canary in the coal mine. And as Ruth Weiss says in this book, that not only are the Jews the canary in the coal mine, but we are the kindlewood. We're the wood that will set up everything and set up the entire society aflame. That in other words, anti-Semitism isn't just about the Jews. Anti-Semitism is about human rights and democratic principles. This disease of hatred and of genocidal hatred will start with Jews, but when we see other groups, moderates, institutions being attacked, we understand the importance of dealing with anti-Semitism not as a parochial Jewish interest, but as a basic human rights interest. This deadly strain of hatred often turns against other groups, such as women, gay, moderate Muslims, and other sectors of the population who are perceived as not being ideologically pure, as well as against the key democratic notions such as citizenship, equality before the law, and pluralism. Anti-Semitism consequently is a universal human rights issue that must be important to all. Certain members of the academic community, especially those who claim to espouse progressive and or postmodernist views, often perceive the study of anti-Semitism as an inherent attempt to undermine any criticism of the State of Israel, and accuse those engaged in the study as being political advocates rather than pursuers of real scholarship or truth. In fact, in this postmodern age, this is a fairly common view in the academy and in intellectual circles. And as a footnote, I come from and many of my colleagues come from sort of a critical, progressive school of scholarship. I was schooled in the United Kingdom at Oxford and the University of London by critical theorists. I have a history of being engaged in human rights. I was a leader in the anti-apartheid movement, fighting racism in Canada, fighting for the First Nations. So I come from this progressive human rights background, and I apply my study and my perspective and my human rights background in trying to understand this reactionary social movement. And yet the chutzpah to even look at this movement would bring upon me and my colleagues all sorts of accusations. In fact, in this postmodern age, this is a fairly common occurrence. It is therefore important to embark on a systematic critique of the intellectual and political impact of this philosophical movement, not only with regard to the safety and security of the Jewish people and their right to self-determination, but also with regard to the integrity of the Enlightenment project and the Enlightenment project and perceptions of modernity. The contemporary canon, this sort of postmodern moment, includes a critique of the traditional Western canon, for example by Michel Foucault and Edward Said. This has also helped, this work has helped to demonize Jewish culture and historical narratives in relation to Israel and beyond. This perspective is now an integral component of many good university curriculums throughout much of the West. Foucault, for example, who's perceived as this progressive philosopher, the bringer of progressive notions like hybridity and narrative and on and on and on, this so-called intellectual, and I say so-called, welcomed the Iranian revolutionary regime of 1979 as a triumph of the spiritual values over the profanity of Western capitalist materialism. So here is somebody supporting the most pernicious, sexist, homophobic, anti-democratic, and anti-Semitic movement known to us since the Holocaust, since fascism. All right, but this is the sacred cow of the universities at this moment. And to critique this, people look at you like you must have fallen off somewhere on your head. He perceived the Islamist revolution as a critique of Western culture and a protest against the political rationality of modernity. This sympathetic view of the Islamist revolution has been ignored, but it undoubtedly influenced the subsequent philosophical discourse and scholarship of Foucault and others. Edward Said, who was in Paris in 1979, fondly recalled spending time with Foucault and noted that they both hoped that the Iranian Revolution would develop into what the French Revolution was to Kant 200 years earlier. Despite its violence, they hoped that the revolution would be a crucial step towards progressive emancipation for the people of Iran and the oppressed peoples of other nations. Their critique of modernity and Western colonial power, combined with a lack of an ethical alternative, prevented these early postmodernists from criticizing the excesses of the Iranian Revolution and its failure to recognize the other as an equal and respected member of society. The works of Foucault and Said have thus helped to lay the foundation for the failure of many contemporary intellectuals to condemn the rise of Islamism as a social movement, especially in relation to its lack of acceptance of basic notions of otherness, of respecting the other, within Islamic society, a cornerstone or foundation of democratic principles, and its vitriolical prejudice against the Jewish people and Israel. This intellectual development should also be considered in the context of global politics and the prevailing environment in many academic institutions where the need for funding, unfortunately, appears to have a growing impact on the curriculum. So, for the blindness of our leaders, of people like Obama and others who came of age in the moment of Edward Said, who came in age in the cafeterias and playgrounds of Harvard and Yale and Columbia University, the fact that he and his colleagues and others in the Western world cannot react to this genocidal regime, and I choose my words carefully, to a regime that is persecuting religious minorities, to a regime that forcibly makes gay men engage in sex change operations. They hang gay people publicly from cranes. They subjugate women, all against our democratic principles that we so happily uphold in the comfort of our comfortable institutions here, that we in the West turn a blind eye to these crimes. These intellectual, ideological, and political crimes. It's our grounding in this philosophical moment that is causing the West's inability to react to this reactionary movement. Furthermore, Edward Said, who, for those of you who don't know, is a very important leading figure in the academy, Said's attempt to undermine the legitimacy of Jewish self-determination in Israel and the Jewish historical narrative in the diaspora needs to be critically examined with regard to its role in the reemergence of anti-Semitism among intellectuals and within the academy. Such a critique of the critique, so the critique of colonialism important, put forth by some of these postmodernists, but we need to critique the critique, is especially urgent at this time, as there seems to be little possibility to address anti-Semitism forcefully within the academy or to express outrage and concern regarding the recent successes of radical Islam despite its reactionary agenda and worldview. Rather, these ideological and philosophical foundations enable leading and respected scholars such as Judith Butler to argue, and Peter Beinart and others to argue, that Hamas and Hezbollah ought to be perceived as part of the progressive global left. Imagine. Feminist and progressive thinkers think that manifestations of a reactionary, genocidal movement ought to be perceived as part of the progressive left by people on the progressive left is absurd. It also encourages observers, including scholars of anti-Semitism, to blame Israel for anti-Semitism throughout the world. So you have scholars of anti-Semitism now writing papers that it's Israel and Zionists who are causing anti-Semitism. And these are the scholars that are starting to get serious funding. Even in the aftermath of the Holocaust, and despite the Academy's preoccupation with colonialism, racism, sexism, socioeconomic, political, and cultural inequality, domination, and critical understandings of the other, anti-Semitism, especially its contemporary manifestations, does not exist in an area of study in the mainstream academic curriculum. Unlike other forms of discrimination, anti-Semitism is not an issue of significant concern. These developments have had an effect of placing attempts to defend the Jews and their legitimate connection to Israel or Jerusalem outside the realm of what is acceptable and proper. This is most troubling given the legacy of anti-Semitism in the academy and in Western civilization more generally, which is yet to be understood and addressed in the same way other forms of discrimination and hatred have. The contemporary perception in some quarters of the Zionist movement as an unfashionable, intellectually defunct, and morally bankrupt remnant of Western colonial racist culture, a perception that pays no attention to the contemporary narrative of Jewish aspirations or Jewish people's millennial spanning history in the region, is therefore a recipe for disaster. At the very least, it creates an uncritical blind spot for the role anti-Semitism plays in the contemporary Middle East. To engage in the study of anti-Semitism is somehow perceived as supportive of the Zionist narrative, while the real threat of anti-Semitism, which poses to society, is left to the side. I think I'm going to leave it there. I speak in the paper about globalization, which I've already touched upon. And I go into the more details of what modernity means, and how this is a crisis, how the crisis of capital, the crisis of capitalism globally, is now affecting the crisis of modernity. That we are, on the one hand, people who are marginalized and out of the global economic, social, and cultural system. People in the Middle East, for example, all the Arab countries together have the same gross national product as Spain, one poor European society. All the Arab societies together have the same gross national product, levels of literacy, poverty. There's a catastrophe happening economically, socially, and culturally. And this is not only an economic catastrophe. The crisis of modernity also is reflective in our inability in the West to defend the narratives of modernity, of enlightenment. So this is sort of this in this globalized moment. This is the crisis of modernity. So I speak on this. I'll just finish quickly by making four quick points. As Bernard-Henri Levy contends, it's the role of the intellectual to shed light where there is darkness. It is the study of anti-Semitism and the struggle to develop social policies that will promote human dignity and respect for all that is once again an urgent calling for scholars. Within this mind, it is important to considering the following 3 points. The failure to recognize anti-Semitism studies as a valid academic discipline contributes to the ongoing mood of apologetic lethargy concerning this long-lasting form of prejudice. No more than ever, there's a need for a vibrant, critical, interdisciplinary research center to develop projects and curriculum in this area. Policy and policy development are needed in areas of the study that need to be included in the area of contemporary anti-Semitism studies. Those who dismiss this as advocacy are pushing a regressive political form of advocacy of their own. The failure of the Academy to assert its independence from funding sources and government influence in the study of human rights and efforts to combat hatred is a failure worthy of research in and of itself, as it goes to the heart of the free debate and democratic principles and practices. Thirdly, anti-Semitism is an issue related to the study of globalization and modernity and postmodernity as well, and needs to be acknowledged as a legitimate issue in Middle Eastern studies. If you go to Middle Eastern studies in a Western university and speak of anti-Semitism, the conversation is stopped. The study of contemporary anti-Semitism from an interdisciplinary perspective is crucial for scholarship, policy, and the protection of human rights and dignity and democratic principles, especially in a moment of silence. As Ruth Weiss has summarized in this book, Jews in democratic societies are not merely the proverbial canaries in the coal mine. They function rather as the kindling used to set the system aflame. Why stop at the Jews? In other words, the study of anti-Semitism is not a parochial matter, but a complex and explosive phenomenon that is bound up with matters of human rights and the protection of human dignity, democratic principles, and citizenship. So I will end it there, and happy to take questions and comments.
Anti-Semitism, but we are really different. There are so many definitions of a Jew, Israeli, Zionist, and Ashkenazi, Sephardi. So you put us all in one. I will give you a new definition of a Jew. It just came out. It's called the non-Jew Jewish. The Israeli or Trotsky or Karl Marx. So we are not really one entity. We are different entities, and anti-Semitism you put us all in one. So that's the first comment I have. The second comment I have is I disagree 100% that we are in the same stage that we were 19th or 20th century. I completely disagree because the political structures that we have in place right now called democracy came all 200 years ago. And today we have a different structure, completely different Take communications, you didn't even mention it, but today the problem is not the majority. The problem is the minorities want rights. So those are the initial comments I have, that really we cannot solve all the problems with the political structure of the 18th century nation state. That's really the shocking thing, according to Alvin Toffler, but many others also discuss that you really can, I mean, including United Nations, including the democratic institutions that we have, they are not able to solve. I mean, take Canada, you know, they have a Senate, 200 years back they established it, and today they have a problem. So how can you resolve new problems or old problems with institutions that do not respond to it? That's my question.
So thank you. So they're good questions. So I would say the first one, so of course there's differences between Jews. There's Ashkenazi, Sephardic, Mizrahi, Ethiopian, now they're finding groups in different parts of Asia. There's all sorts of different Jewish traditions and cultural influences, different schools of thought. It's a rich, dynamic, amazing group and civilization. Incredible. But the thing with anti-Semitism is that all of these unique aspects of the Jewish people are defined by people who are not Jewish, most of the time. Not always, but most of the time. So the thing with discrimination is it's a power dynamic. So if this reactionary social movement, say of radical Islam, is able to define the Jew in a certain way, and they're able to implement this ideology and the view of the Jew, and it threatens the security of Jews and other people, that's a problem. So, yeah, of course, if you go to Montreal, there's different yeshivas, different ways of perceiving the text. It's beautiful. There's other people who celebrate their Judaism through Zionism or through, I don't know what, bagels. But the thing with this threat of radical political Islam is that they're defining the Jews in the most disgusting, pernicious way. And we have to deal with it. And I think, tragically, we have to wake up not only, in a bizarre way, I think that this radical reactionary social movement is easy because they're clear, they're consistent, they're open, they're obvious, they're in your face, they're not ashamed. They are fighting for the worldview completely open, completely. They don't hide it in general. But it's we in the West who are unable to address it. And I find that most disturbing because there's all sorts of assumptions that we live in a democratic society and that we promote human rights and we're going to pursue justice, but the wake-up calls are not having an effect. And I find that more dangerous. The Islamists, we know where they're coming from, we know who they are, we know what they want, and they're rising in power. The fact that people who are apparently concerned about progressive politics and human rights and institutions which are supposed to reflect it are silent, this to me is our greatest challenge. And I think, you're right, institutions are not responding to the problems, and in part because globalization is weakening the institutions that we depended upon. We have the internet that is not monitored. The United States of America, because of its First Amendment, is becoming the space where domains are locating and spewing hatred all over the world. And it's a serious issue. The gentleman in the back, thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My question is, how can we reconcile Iran, which on one hand is incredibly anti-Semitic, with on the other hand is one of the largest, one of the places where there's the largest Jewish community inside the Muslim world?
No.
So how do we reconcile that?
Yeah.
So it's complex, it's complicated. So there's about 25,000 Jews left in Iran. It's an interest. Some don't have the capacity to leave. Some have moved their families out, but say the men stay and do business and they commute. It's not a great place to be, but they're there. And there have been other instances where Jews have stayed in places that are difficult and dangerous, and why they stay. Home is home, and it's complicated. But I don't think that the fact that there's 25,000 Jews there living in relative safety for now diminishes the fact that this is a regime and an ideology that is very clear on its perceptions of Jews. And there's also, if you go deeper into radical Islamic thought, Jews who accept their role as basically dhimmi or second-class citizens are kosher, more or less. Because in Shiite Islam you have 17th century fatwas, or Talmudic rulings, that so Jews are considered impure, right? So there's a whole religious ruling. So if Jews are impure and it's raining outside and Jews are stuck in the rain, you know all this stuff, right?
But those laws are pre-Islamic.
No, it's 17th century. They're Shiite Islamic. The rabbis got together and had some Talmudic discussions, and they had religious rulings. For example, since Jews are impure, if it's raining and a Jewish person's clothes get wet and the water starts to go from their garments onto the pavement in Persia, in 17th century and 18th century Persia, what do? So the fatwa is you dig up the pavement and you dispose of it because the pavement has become impure. To this day, the 25,000 Jews that this young man was saying cannot drink from the same water fountains because they're not pure today. And it's been like that for centuries. So you have a fusion of a certain strand of Shiite Islam and its perception of the Jew fused with European construction. So if the Jew accepts that fate as being impure and perhaps the descendants of apes and pigs, and they know their place and they clean sewers and they don't want to occupy certain professions, and they maintain their status in that society, in that structure, then it's okay. They're fine. They're welcome people of the book. But once a Jew has the audacity to have self-determination or claim to be equal citizens under the law, or assert any form of self-determination anywhere on Islamic land, that ideology and that movement, which is anti-Islamic, needs to be eradicated. So if a Jew wants to be equal, has the audacity to even think this is where the problems come in for this form, and this is a form of Shiite Islam. It's not Shiite Islam, but it's alive and very much well, as we can see in certain parts of the Middle East. And it's this which, if you believe in democracy, if you believe that everybody should be equal under the law and everybody should have a strong notion of citizenship, this is what you fight. Intellectually and ideologically, and you don't tolerate the intolerable. You fight it, and you don't make excuses for it.
Also, is it the fact that it's the most ancient community, the Jewish community. That's why there's those remnants, because all the Jews of Arab countries left.
Yeah.
They were so anchored, so part of the society that they stayed.
Yeah. There's a gentleman here.
We have to be somewhat cautious when we frame the catalysis of this organization of Muslim movements in the perspective of anti-Semitism. After all, if we look back historically, many movements, whether they be Sharia, and I'll give you the example of Deoband, which eventually became Taliban, were simply for the purpose of preserving the religion. Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt actually has its roots back into the 1920s and 1930s. They started, I don't remember the militia, they weren't as successful as using, let's say, what you described as a mosque in order to create their social structure. But certainly Deoband and later Taliban were using the madrasa in order to complete their view. The important issue is to make that connection between the enactment of Sharia law and its associated fatwas and the ultimate end of reaching the destruction of Jews. We discuss this in terms of the state of Iran, which is very, very relevant to our day. But at the same time, realizing that there's discrimination against the Jews, we have to realize that the bottom barrel has never been the Jews, they've always been the Baha'i. The Jews only became the forefront of Islamic hatred, in my opinion. I'm looking at the other perspective. We come to the same conclusion, but we come from different perspectives upon the establishment of the State of Israel. Prior, the enmity had the polemic, the main polemic. There had been Jewish-Islamic polemic, but the main polemic had always been Christianity, Byzantium, or the remnants of what was Byzantium, or the Holy Roman Empire, or whatever had been there, and Islam. Later, this was replaced in the 20th century. This was replaced with the state when the State of Israel was founded. And why? Not because Israel or Judaism was such a horrible institution, but rather because it was a ghost or a shadow of Western civilization. We present ourselves again with the clash of Occident versus Orient, and I think that's the issue that we have here. Not so much the Jew becoming the focus of enmity, as opposed to the Sunni or the Assyrian or the Zoroastrian. What we have is a clash of cultures, and Judaism, unfortunately, through its tremendous success, the tremendous success of the State of Israel, which has brought tremendous rewards. We have the yin, but we also have a yang on the other side. As much as it did positive benefit the world positively, it also gave rise to this enmity, unfortunately, that, at least this is the way I saw it. So, starting with these institutions, which I believe already were inlaid in Islamic culture, the organization towards or against Jews became an offshoot or an offspring of this convergence of the two cultures. You also brought up, well, I think you were a little bit too hard on Michel Foucault. I have to be a bit apologetic towards him, because in 1979 he could not possibly have anticipated that the political errors, that the incoherent international policy of the United States would lead to such a terrible series of events. Now, first with the Islamic Revolution, the Iran-Iraq War, the Gulf War, and you can even say the showdowns that we're seeing. We can even say the Arab Spring is a political logical sequence which all started from the failure of the United States to defend the regime of the Shah. I'm going to make one third point very quickly, whereas you mentioned the labeling of many of these factions, Hamas and Islamic extremists, as a progressive, leftist progressives. Is that correct?
Judith Butler and Peter Beinart said that we should perceive them as such.
Very good. Now, I'm going to give you this postmodernist view that depends very much on your perspective. I'm sure there are many people who would consider Haribat Sunnah, ETA, the IRA, the Lord's Resistance Army, M23, as progressive leftists as well. But it's simply serving their interests. I'm sure at the time there were some who regard Stalinism as progressive and leftist at the same time. So even though it doesn't serve the best interest, it can still fit into that realm, for better, for worse. And it's the mistake of the people understanding demographic, as we saw in Iran in 1979. Failure to understand the social strata that leads to this misidentification from manifesting into evil.
So then I agree with this last point. So failing to see the social structure. So it's amazing. So Edward Said's work and Foucault's work to the end never recognized the social structure of society. To speak about minorities in the Arab world, was something we didn't speak of, we didn't see until the Arab Spring. It was a block, and Edward Said's work sees in Orientalism, or in Orientalism, sees the Middle East or Arab culture as this block. It's only with the disintegration of the state or the Arab uprising, whatever has been taking place, that we're starting to talk about minority rights and other issues in the Middle East. So that's interesting. So we agree there. And that's the failure of their work. Michel Foucault and Edward Said are in Paris in the late 70s. Ayatollah Khomeini is in Paris in the late 70s. He was writing extraordinarily clear text about the Jews. And if these two gentlemen were promoting or supportive of this regime, they had to go down the street and read the stuff that was coming out of these guys. It was clear.
Moderate Rouhani was translated.
Yeah,
he was there too.
He was in Paris at the time too.
Moderate.
So I think it's incumbent upon scholars. We all make mistakes for sure. But if you're promoting a revolution and the leaders of the revolution are living down the road from you, I think it's incumbent to say, what's going on here?
Might have also seen this as a transitional step. After all, we had French Robespierre. We had maybe that's how they saw it, and that's also part of the mistake.
Perhaps, yeah. But certainly a mistake, which as scholars we need to, maybe not throw the baby out with the bathwater, but to understand and to critique. And we largely don't. If you start engaging in a critique of Foucault and Edward Said, then you are in a box before you speak. So that we have to do away with the categorization and have a discussion, explore the ideas. Okay. Sorry, you and then you. Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. I have a friend who's a retired professor, and she's not Jewish, and she complains bitterly about the inability of students to discriminate, to think for themselves, with the rise of relativity of everything.
Relativism.
Everything is acceptable. And what she has done is to create a website, and she goes out and interviews people and, tries to promote thinking clearly about these issues through her website. So my question is, and my comment is, how do we bring this to the world, and how do the leaders arise who can address these issues?
So it's a good question. I wish I had the answer. I don't. There's groups of us trying. We're trying to create centers and create courses and curriculum and get people to come and to study and to listen and to debate. I was saying in the seminar, at Raphael's seminar last week, when I was a student at Oxford, I had two supervisors. One was this renowned Marxist intellectual thinker, David Harvey, and the other one was sort of this liberal, positivist, conservative scholar named Carrie Peach. And one was into social theory and philosophy, and one was into numbers and statistics, and that was the way to understand society. So two professors diametrically opposed ideologically. Their entire worldview, or much of the worldview, was not only different, but opposing each other. But when I would write and present my work to them, they would critique me in a way, they would poke holes in my argument, not to change my view, but to argue with me, to make my argument, to constructively critique me so my argument would be stronger. And we would debate, and the students would debate, and we would go into seminars, and I would come armed. I would have read 20 articles, and the guy that I'd be debating would read 30 articles, and we would take the seminar to dinner or to a pub and argue and discuss, and we would read, somebody would suggest, well, you're not reading this guy, go read this guy, and I would go read that guy and critique him. I'd come with my critique, and it was a wonderful opportunity and place to be, because there wasn't anything that was unacceptable. You had to be, it was about ideas and arguing about ideas. And I find today, first of all, I don't know how much people are into ideas to begin with, but those who are into ideas, I find if you critique them or argue with them, it becomes very personal. It's no longer about ideas. So I think this moment, the intellectual climate is not conducive for what is needed. We need to have debates, honest debates, and really get these type of ideas out. On a positive note, I'm working with a colleague of mine who's his name is Harris Rafiq, who works with he worked with Tony Blair and now Cameron, and he's working to fight the Islamicization of the Muslim community in the UK. And they've been very successful in the United Kingdom. The problem of Muslims who are fighting extremism in the Western world, they feel that in North America, particularly in the US, there isn't an awareness, and there's groups coming. So some colleagues and I think we're starting to do shows. Charlie Rose, there's a few people who are starting to do shows where moderate Muslims who are fighting anti-Semitism, who are claiming that those in the West who are silent in the face of this reactionary movement, who perceive Islamic culture as inherently reactionary and backwards, that these paternalistic liberals are the racists. The people like me and others who are fighting anti-Semitism and fighting for minority rights and against sexism in Muslim societies are people who we believe that they also have the right to live in a free democratic society, to be Muslim but to live in a democracy. And those who dismiss it are the problem. So we're trying to create programs, curriculum, try and get the ideas out into the media, but it's not an easy battle, and time is of the essence.
First of all, thanks for a great talk, interesting, and I learned a few things. But I have to first say that before I ask the question, is a couple of things troubled me. It's that why is it necessary to sort of rely on the intellectual categories of, say, 70 years ago, for example, progressive, reactionary? I mean, you mentioned that you have a background in progressive causes, human rights. Of course, you're well aware that this impresses none of the people of your colleagues who call themselves progressives nowadays, because there's a strong strain of anti-Semitism in many progressive schools of thought, even from the beginning. I mean, you mentioned Yale. Did Paul de Man teach at Yale?
Yep.
Okay, so, and even Marx, of course.
Paul de Man was this important German philosopher. It turns out he never had a PhD and was basically a Nazi sympathizer, who was the darling of Yale up until the 80s, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's even from the beginning, people, progressives, used to have this thing about Lenin and about Marx, and it turns out that even from the beginning, these people were intellectually dishonest. My parents have also a leftist background, but you know, why is it necessary to people with these kind of, perhaps Israel and we Jews believe that these categories, that perhaps we supersede these categories. I mean, is there any intellectual way to say this in the academy? I don't know. It's why do we have? I mean, it seems like a prison. That's all. I mean, it seems a prison in that many people, for example, want to deny the Jews the right of self-determination. They'll invent all kinds of rationales that the Jews aren't. There was a book, The Jews Are an Invented People. You mentioned intellectuals. The editor of the Nouvel Observateur in Paris is a Jew, but he's come out and said that Israel is an embarrassment to the Jewish people.
J Street is also not helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, I mean, in many ways it reminds me of these, the internecine battles that intellectuals had in the 20s. I mean, I don't know why we have to rely on those categories anymore. That's the only quibble I have.
Right.
Okay.
That's, and in a way I don't disagree with you. I think you're right. But at the same time, having said that, and I mean it, I'm not, I think to have credibility in the academy, it's like, okay, so you say you're progressive, well, look at my work and look at my work on human rights and in politics and in writing and what does it mean to be liberal and progressive? You use these terms, they use these terms, but what does it mean? If you're really progressive and you really believe in human rights and equality, what are you doing? So for whatever it's worth, I use it for street cred in a way, because I've been there and I've done it at a level where a lot of these characters never even bothered, and they speak in the name of something that they're just hypocrites. So I agree with you, but I use it to make a point, I guess. So Bria, and then
I have one comment and then so I think maybe another point that in the academy or amongst intellectuals, I think there's a trend to be self-critical, and then that's an important way that they look at all sorts of issues too, and that you can see that in literature. You can see that when you read any article. It's what is the bias of this author? Where are they coming from? And even in movements like feminism, there is talk there of how do women propagate anti-feminist issues too. So there's a self-critical lens that's there. And I think maybe one aspect of the issue with anti-Semitism and discussing it that's maybe missing is what is our obsession with it? And maybe that's just like a self-critical lens that the academy also is open to, and maybe that's a particular approach.
whose obsession with it? Who's we?
Well, you said it's like a parochial topic.
I see.
Jewish, amongst Jews is the topic of.
No, I was trying to make the point that in the academy and mainstream society, anti-Semitism, I would argue, is perceived as a parochial issue. It's only Jews talking about it for Jewish interests.
Okay.
And I'm saying that it's an issue that ought to be mainstream, and the academy and policymakers should take it seriously. It's not just a Jewish issue.
But I think it ends up becoming a Jewish issue, spoken oftentimes within Jewish circles. That's what you're addressing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was just like maybe that's also where Foucault is coming from, and a lot of those other scholars, in saying like, let's look at ourselves, let's look at the West and blame ourselves, and maybe that's also a trend of individualism too. Like we have our own issues, and not let's look at what's going on in the Middle East and point fingers. But maybe it's like they have their problems, we have our problems. Maybe
right.
That's just and the question is, how would you define Islamophobia? And do you think that should be an issue as much as anti-Semitism and Islamophobia?
Cool. So good points, good question. So it's interesting. So I don't think the Jewish community does at all what you think, what you mentioned. I think women, and if you look at the anti-colonial struggle and the anti-racist movement and negritude and Mies Césaire and Fanon and gender studies and feminist studies, people empowered themselves by looking at structures of power all around them, what it meant to be black or African or a woman, and how Africans perpetuated racism and women perpetuated being the victim of being second-class citizens and abused and all the stuff, right? They situated themselves in power structures. It doesn't happen in the Jewish community. You know, we don't speak about anti-Semitism like that, and I think that would be actually a very powerful point. I was with a group of people a couple of weeks ago talking about Iran, for example, and I started speaking about how it's in the interest of oil companies and banks to get rid of sanctions in Iran. And what does that mean towards us? And this was among powerful business people in New York City, Jewish business people in New York City, and they looked at me like I was nuts. So there isn't a self-awareness and self-criticism of where we stand in power structures and how we relate to power. Like the feminist movement and the anti-colonial, anti-racist movement did in different parts of the world. And I think we ought to do some of that soul-searching. But then, you know, the stereotypes and the tropes of anti-Semitism and the accusation of Jewish power and Jewish this and Jewish that and conspiracies around it, I think also handcuffs us to even look at this issue. You know, is it good that people think we're powerful? Do we really want to look into the mirror and see how maybe not powerful we are? It's a very complicated thing. So, but yeah, I think we should situate ourselves critically within structures of power domestically and internationally, like other movements did, and we haven't at all. I don't even know if there's literature on it. I refer to Robin Cohn and Bonich in terms of middlemen, but really looking at economic structures and linguistic structures, and we don't do it much. So I think your point is well taken. But I think, and it's good to be self-critical, to situate ourselves in notions of positionality and authenticity and all this postmodern stuff. It's wonderful, and we should do it. At the same time, you know, Iran is building a nuclear weapon, and the West is basically, I have to say, aiding and abetting. It's become so obvious now. They're aiding and abetting. And what do we do as Jews? You know, how come we're not on the streets? Could you imagine, I was part of the anti-apartheid movement, could you imagine a white leader of an African country coming to New York and saying that Africans are descendants of apes and pigs and are subhuman, and I represent the state of X in Africa, come and do business with me. And all the Western leaders come and do business with that leader. So at the General Assembly, Western leaders were going to have serious meetings about all kinds of serious strategic and economic issues with people who believe that Jews are the descendants of apes and pigs. And there's not a word from anybody, even from our community, from the human rights community. There's nothing. So yeah, there's a lot of work to do. And then in terms of Islamophobia, it's a concept that I don't like, and many scholars who are concerned about discrimination of Muslims and others don't like. It's a term that the Iranian revolutionary regime actually created. It's created by the regime, and it's used as an effective tool to handcuff people to fight this reactionary social movement, because if you fight the reactionary social movement, you are being accused of being Islamophobic. So it's part of a propaganda war, the term. That's not to say that there's discrimination against Muslims, and any form of discrimination against Muslims or others should be taken very seriously in Western democratic societies and also in Muslim societies. So if you're a moderate Muslim, a woman, I don't know, an urban, working middle-class person, and you want to live a life with democratic principles, you should be fighting for your rights, right? We shouldn't just stop the debate there. We should be supporting progressive people in the Middle East, not being quiet because we're being accused of all sorts of things surrounding Islamophobia or our low expectations of Muslims in the Middle East. So I think it's a dangerous concept. So on the one hand, strong citizenship for all, promoting democratic human right values. If anybody is being discriminated because of religious belief, that should be fought and understood and fought. But Islamophobia is a term that's being used for ideological reasons in this war at the level of propaganda, in my opinion.
I admire what you're doing because this is a time to inform people. I think people are not informed enough. When you look at the school system, kids don't even have history classes. They don't situate themselves in the world as such. I see the Canadian curriculum is studying here in Quebec of Quebec and Canada and Quebec. And the kids come out of there and they have no idea what you're talking about by debating an idea. Or this is the century of modern communication. We're going into a new phase, and a lot of people don't even know what the future is. It's important. The Muslims, well, anti-Semitism has existed forever, since Babylon, Romans. I think it's inbred in the rest of the world, unfortunately. But with Muslim, it's something very special, because when you look at the Quran, you look at the Sharia, it's antinomic to democracy. So I admire what you're doing. When in '98 I attended a conference with Dr. Sultan was here and Dawish was here, and they were warning us already. And they said, okay, so if only 2% of the people are terrorists, where are the 98%? Why don't they stand up and why don't they say something? Yeah. And that's a whole cultural thing. And Dr. Sultan told me, I'm afraid to say, they are scared. So this is where we have to work to kind of, I don't know, is it our responsibility to give them the strength to get up and say something, to live, to survive, to... It seems to me it's like and today propaganda is so important as it was during the Second World War, as we saw. It's being repeated, it's being used by the Muslim world very efficiently, and Israel did not do anything to defend themselves for a long time. Now they're starting to come up with some YouTubes here and there and explaining. We have to explain the facts. We have to give history courses to the world, tell them how things came about. It seems like they just see the tip of the iceberg, and they just, oh, there's a tip of the iceberg, but they do not see how it came about.
Yes, no, you touch on very important issues. So yeah, this information age and the impact of it is staggering and frightening.
Yes.
There's no time to think and analyze and put things into context. I remember during the Arab Spring, which has become, in my mind, the Islamic winter, I remember at Yale, all these professors and great intellectuals were so excited about the Arab Spring. And the media, if you remember, was very exciting images of demonstration and fireworks, and it was exciting. Everybody ran home every night to watch what was happening. But what was the context? What did people want? So everybody was screaming Allah Akbar, and I told my Yale professor friends, I read René Descartes and Hegel and Marx, and they don't refer to Allah Akbar. What does it mean? What do they want? Right? What's the context? Who did a social survey? Who analyzed what these people were fighting for? There was nothing. But the images and the information was very beautiful and sexy and exciting, and it was wonderful. But what's the context? We have to analyze to be analytical is not just information, it's to go deeper.
I'm not an intellectual. Yeah. I lived in an Arab country and I saw it right away. And I warned everybody around, but they were, no, they're going to...
Which country?
Morocco.
Morocco.
So I saw this since I was young, and I saw the independence, and we couldn't get out in the streets.
So, but that's the amazing thing, that Western intellectuals do not need to read Arabic, they don't need to know Islam, they don't need to know the context, they don't need to do surveys, they don't need to know the economic structures. We know. If we're nice to them, they're going to change to be like we want them. No. It's absurd. So we have to contextualize, you're right. And I'll say another thing. I'm being taped, so I'm going to be polite. I was recently at an Ivy League university a leading professor was running a seminar with us on anti-Semitism. And one of my colleagues, who's also a professor at an Ivy League university, went up to the professor afterwards and said, "Thank you so much. You're so brave for doing the seminar on ISGAP." And these are two highly esteemed professors. They're of a generation older than me, and I always taught by my parents who are here to be respectful of the elderly and to have a little bit of culture. You have to nod after. You can only disagree after the seminar. So I turned to them and I said, like, "What the hell are you doing? What do you mean?" So one professor said to the other, "You were very brave for doing the seminar for ISGAP, because talking about anti-Semitism in the academy, you have to be brave. And this is a university where there's issues with, put it this way, Edward Said was a professor there. So if you'll know the university, some of you. And I turned to these two professors and I said, "You're brave, you're tenured professors in this Ivy League university, your careers are made, you're done, and you think you're brave? What about professors and scholars and intellectuals in Damascus, in Gaza, in Rabat, wherever it is, who are fighting for democracy? We are silent, and we have the capacity to not be silent."
Yes.
And a tenured professor in Ivy League University is brave for bringing another professor to talk to 30 people. Please. So we need to look. The Soviet Jewry movement was created by students and housewives, and it's time for students and housewives to start, because
Yeah, I think that's where the revolution is going to come from.
Yes.
I hope. Mr. Fischler. Uh-oh, here it comes.
We're basically seeing the Muslim world being torn apart by the schism between Shia and Sunni, of which they are slaughtering each other now almost throughout wherever they live. And one side is a heretic, the other side's a heretic, and it's horrendous. Hundreds of thousands are dead. So if they cannot accept the other, and it goes back to Hussein the martyr and everything else, aren't you being a bit of an apologist if we look at what Christopher Hitchens called Islamic fascism?
What, am I being a bit of a what?
If we take the three pillars of Islam, one, the Jews became corrupt. That's why Muhammad, the prophet, was sent down. Two, the land of Israel is holy Muslim land. Three, the hadith of the commentaries, as you've gone on and on, talks of us as being the descendants of apes and pigs. There's no room for dialogue. There's no room for students and housewives. There's perhaps room for what Rabbi Kahana said, is that you smash anti-Semites and you don't apologize for them like you seem to be doing. And you're sounding like Beinhart or the liberal New York Times. There's no common ground, as Lou Reed, of blessed memory, would say in his Kurt Waldheim song. I mean, you call these people for what they are.
What did you mean by that? So I agree with you and I disagree with you. So I agree that people who reject the other or see the other as subhuman,
It's integral to their holiness.
hold on, I'm going to respond, sir. So people who have that ideology, be it radical Islamists, I won't say Muslims, but radical Islamists or apartheid supporters or slavery supporters, yeah, you fight them and you smash them. You fight them intellectually and ideologically, and if need be, economically and even militarily. I have no problem with that. You're 100% right. If they start imposing their will on the other, you fight. Where we differ, and I think there's a big difference, is that there are within Islamic traditions and among Muslims today who are intellectuals, who are leaders, who are religious thinkers, politicians, journalists, members of the corporate world, members of the intellectual classes, decent human beings. There are traditions in Islam of accepting the other. For example, the 6 Muslims that I'm trying to put on the Charlie Rose show, they are not, they don't deny their Islamic faith. They're practicing Muslims that celebrate their Islamic faith. And within their interpretations of Islam, they completely and fully recognize not only the state of Israel, but the right of Jews to self-determination in the homeland that is mentioned in the Quran. So these are Muslims who are being smashed and driven out of their institutions and homelands, who draw upon traditions that are very accepting and respectful of the other. And these are the people that I have to say, we have to support and work with, because they're genuinely, in their understanding of their faith, completely. I've grilled them, hung out with them, argued with them, discussed with them. They're completely able to accept the other as Muslims. These are the people we have to work with and empower. Not to go to Cairo like Obama did and empowered the Islamists. And the people in the West are empowering, we are empowering the reactionary Islamists. And these are the people, these are the good people who are being smashed. And they're being driven out of their homes because of Western support, Obama support of reactionary thuggery. So we have to work with moderate people, and I think they're still there. And unlike you, I won't condemn Islam, I'll condemn radical political Islam, and that's where I draw the line.
One thing I think we have to mention, that Iran didn't change at all its speech.
No?
At all. And I've been following. And all of a sudden, there is this way of approaching, and I don't understand. And as you mentioned, that's an economical issue. But it's really an economic issue in a world that has so other economical issue to resolve. This is one question. I have 2 other questions straight to the point. Is it true that in the UK they raised in the curriculum the study of the Holocaust?
Not true.
It's not true.
It's a lie circulating on the internet.
Yeah, I
Not
wanted
true.
to ask you. And the second, do you think that the Pope, what he's doing now, is contributing in a way to diminish the anti-Semitism or not?
Yeah.
Because something new, is a new phenomenon.
Yeah. So I think that this will be the last question because it's getting late, but I'll respond. So I'm not an expert on Vatican politics or on Christianity, Catholicism, but I have to say that some of the statements that this current Pope is making is astounding. It's amazing. That I would never have imagined the Pope to say the things that he's been saying. That, Christ was Jewish, and if you're anti-Semitic, you're anti-Catholic. It's powerful stuff. And in addition, we're opening a center in Rome at the end of the month. And I have a colleague who's starting ISGAP in Italy, and he kept saying, come here, come here, come here. Anyway, it took me about 2 years to take him seriously, and I went. And he took me on a tour. I met the Minister of Education, I met one of the representatives in the Vatican, the heads of universities, presidents of universities. It was amazing. Head of the Supreme Court. He took me on this tour. And wherever I went, from the Vatican to the Supreme Court to the Ministry of Education, they said the problems of Israel and the problems of the Jews are our problems. And everything is open in Rome. So I have a colleague who's amazing, but it's not just his amazing work. I think the Italians see themselves at the forefront or on the border of the Islamic world, and they're worried. And the French Anglo world in Europe is oblivious to what's going on, and they get it. And it's conservative and liberal people in Italian society there. So I don't know if it's because of the Pope. I don't know. But the atmosphere in Italy is amazing. Yeah. Thanks. Okay. So thank you very much. So thank you. And so on December the 4th, we have Professor Mansour, who's a professor of political science, Muslim, dealing with anti-Semitism from a Muslim perspective, which Mr. Fischler will introduce him. the United States, the Americas, Australia, South Africa, places that were established on racist, colonial theology, philosophy, and tactics, Western intellectuals after World War II and after the Holocaust began to critically look at their history. So to criticize those who were once colonized, to criticize those who were once the object of our racist, colonial bigotry is problematic, and it ought to be problematic, by the way. But what has happened in this post-colonial moment is our inability to criticize the other even when they deserve to be criticized. And a reactionary social movement like radical political Islam, I'm not speaking about Muslims and I'm not speaking about Islam, but radical political Islam is a reactionary social movement that is diametrically opposed to what everybody in this room believes in. If you believe that in citizenship, the rights of women, the rights of gay people, the rights of minorities ought to be enshrined, that everybody ought to be equal under one legal system and have strong notions of citizenship. If you're opposed to racist notions like Jews are the descendants of apes and pigs or should be exterminated, then there's a problem. And the academy, what happened at Yale, there is a limitation for political reasons, for funding reasons, for oil-related reasons, for geostrategic reasons, not to allow this problem to become an issue. It gets in the way. And I dare say what's happened in the last several days with the Obama administration and other administrations trying to expedite a treaty with the Iranian revolutionary regime, a regime which clearly, not once in a while, but its raison d'etre is to rid the Jews of this region, of the Middle East. It's not 1967 boundaries or 1973 boundaries or 1948 boundaries. It's to eradicate the Jewish people, the descendants of apes and pigs. Subhuman, non-humans have to be eradicated from the garment of Islam. And Western leaders are willing to set aside inconveniences in trade, inconveniences in the price of oil, inconvenience in banking and other ways to make profits at the expense of not just Jews, not only Jews, but Baha'is, other religious minorities, women, gay people, moderate people, people who care about democracy. That is almost irrelevant in the eyes of too many Western governments and Western intellectuals. To be labeled as right-wing, neoconservative, or Islamophobic. Likewise, despite their obvious and sometimes extraordinary credentials, their scholarship is also unfairly criticized or condemned as being advocacy. Such accusations are often made by those who engage in advocacy themselves and actually constitute a form of anti-Semitism. Others simply embrace the gatekeeper role in the academy, which Robin Cohn describes as an attempt to maintain the status quo on behalf of institutional interests. There's also a theory by Bonich that it's a theory of the middleman minorities, which is a famous theory in sociology in which the minority has to become the gatekeeper, or plays the gatekeeper within the institution. And we can see tragically that there are many Jewish intellectuals, I hate to say it, but it's actually the truth, Jewish intellectuals who have become the gatekeepers, who stand up to criticize Israel with more vehemence than many others, and to also quiet down those of us who want to study anti-Semitism as scholarship, and were condemned as being right-wing, Islamophobic, and the like. So it's very interesting. So these two theories by Cohn and Bonich are very important to understand the role of minorities coming into the institutions, coming into the academy. And I think in a fantastic example of this, which is reminiscent of the McCarthy era, we have an example of Nathan Glazer, who was a very important sociologist, social thinker of the time, who worked on behalf of the McCarthy, Joe McCarthy, and he took it upon himself to spy on and report to the committee on the Jewish community of scholars and political activists in order to silence political views that were deemed unacceptable at the time. So a very prominent scholar took it upon himself, told McCarthy I'll take care of the Jewish community. You don't spy on the Jewish community. I'll do it for you. And he reported to the committee. So it's interesting that people like Chomsky, Finkelstein, and many others, the New York Times, I can think of I forget his name. I'm having a moment here. The professor of NYU is now working for Haaretz. Officially, no. He's Obama's buddy. Young guy, South African born. Peter Beinart. People like this who, there's an irrationality that people who claim to be liberal and progressive are actually defending Islamists. So the academic activities, in particular those that examine state-sponsored anti-Semitism, Iran, the Muslim Brotherhood, and other sensitive issues, are denounced as advocacy by those with an interest in promoting U.S. administration's general policy of engagement with Islamic states, which I wrote this 3 years ago, this part of the introduction, and imagine 3 years ago, can you imagine if we were, over 100,000 dead Syrians, 3 million refugees, Libya in flames, Egypt is a disaster, and Western governments in bed with Islamists, courting Islamists, and still to this day. And in a sense, in this environment, I call in this article that there has to be serious research and analysis of who's funding institutions, who's funding universities, who's funding the media, and why is there silence on this issue? The fact that Al Jazeera, which is now reaching more than 50 million Americans, was sold to this group for tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars by Gore. How do we accept this outlet of hatred, of inspiring genocidal anti-Semitism, homophobia, and sexism, and there's not much of an opposition to this? Who's benefiting from this, etc. So the article that I'm going to speak to now deals with global anti-Semitism and the crisis of modernity, which currently affects core elements of Western society and civilization. Is it possible that the emergence of the current wave of global anti-Semitism both reflects and forms a part of a wider attack on the core elements of modernity, notions of enlightenment and Western civilization more generally, by reactionary social forces empowered by the crisis of capitalism? The crisis of capitalism. It is against this background that participants in our conference came from far and wide to engage. So the crisis of capitalism, I'll just say as a footnote, is that in the last several decades we entered into this period of neoliberal globalization that has been governed by neoliberal Today I'm going to speak about issues of the title of the talk is called Global Anti-Semitism, A Crisis of Modernity. And I'm going to put around the book. We actually just published the book. It's a 5-volume book. This is 1 volume. On a conference that we organized. It was the largest conference ever, largest academic conference ever on anti-Semitism. So we organized it at Yale in 2010. We had 107 speakers over a 3-day period. And we've produced 5 volumes, 5 books of about 70 articles, and this is one volume. And it's a rough draft. The version will be available on our website in the next 3 or 4 weeks, so you can download it for free or buy a hard copy. So this book starts with reviewing the conference on anti-Semitism. And to make a long story short, we had 107 speakers from 23 countries. We had leading up-and-coming scholars, postdoc students from all over the world, leading scholars who've dedicated their entire life, academic life and career, to dealing with anti-Semitism. And this conference was it was the beginning of the end at Yale. And the reason why it was the beginning of the end is that there is a moment, we're in a moment in this, what I call the crisis of modernity, in which to deal with this reactionary social movement which is sweeping the Middle East, sweeping Islamic societies, is politically incorrect to deal with in the West. And it's politically incorrect for all sorts of reasons. There's, for good reason in the intellectual environment, there was this sort of post-colonial movement that the West, especially after World War II, began to realize that their colonial exploits had a very negative side, and there was a negative side to modernity. Elias talks about the civilizing process and how when we go to civilize the other, a tendency and perhaps the logical outcome of civilizing the other could result and has resulted in forms of genocide. So after World War II, after the excesses of nationalism, once Western scholars began to look at the history of slavery, of colonialism, and of genocide, places in the New World like Canada, the intellectuals. So what we ran into as a research center is very much, I would argue, symbolic of the times that we live in. How to critique a reactionary social movement when our own intellectual world, the world of postmodernity, Edward Said, Michel Foucault, which speaks about postmodernism and relativism. How do we in the West stand up for human rights, stand up for notions of what is right and what is wrong, what is just and what is unjust, when our own philosophical framework is become replaced by a relativist model? And this is, in a sense, the title of the paper is Global Antisemitism, a crisis of modernity. I think tries to capture the crisis of not only of capitalism and of capital, but the crisis of modernity. And the crisis is, are we capable of standing up and defending modernity? So the bad side of modernity was the colonial project, was racism, genocide, even the Holocaust. This is the dark side of modernity. But the positive side, the enlightened side, the side of light, democratic principles, citizenship, there's a positive element to modernity, and are we able, in a sense, to understand and protect these very important notions in which we are dependent upon and we don't inherit? So the conference and the work of our institute really comes at this moment, and I think we had 600 people at the event. It was a major event, and this was the beginning of the end. The Muslim Brotherhood, Iranian interests, Saudi interests sort of descended upon Yale, and to make a long story short, we were eventually closed down. ISGAP is now, the Torah says one door closes, other doors open. So we're running programs at McGill, Fordham, Stanford, Harvard University. We started at Columbia University. We're opening in Miami. And in the end of November, we're opening at Sapienza University. We're creating an institute in Rome. So sometimes when one door closes, others open. So there is a growing interest in this issue and trying to understand the contemporary context of global anti-Semitism. So it's not uncommon for scholars of anti-Semitism, especially those who are engaged in the study of its contemporary manifestations,